Good afternoon, everybody. My name is AJ Kuftik. I'm Principal Technologist with Expedient. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We have a fantastic finale to our multi-cloud madness. Real quick housekeeping note, please enter all of those questions down about here into the Q&A panel. That helps us keep track of them. We have a special 1-hour event today, so please get those questions in. Let's have an actual conversation today. I'm really excited to introduce some of our guests here. If you ask a question, you're entered to win a prize. That prize today is a $100 Amazon gift card. And all of this is being recorded. So if you miss anything, you can go to our website, go.expedient.com/webinar replays, youtube.com/expedient, instagram.com/_expedient, linkedin.com/expedient. Hey, everybody on LinkedIn Live, how are you doing today? And also you'll get a link to this in your email. Now, Multi-Cloud Madness has been a fantastic event for us this month. We're really glad that many of you have joined us, but we wanted to end it with a bang. And that's why we've brought together 3 luminaries to help us kind of talk through what the industry is seeing overall for a multi-cloud. First, I want to introduce Bob Evans from CloudWars. Bob, how are you doing?
Great, AJ, good to be with you.
Thanks, Bob. We have Gene Torres from Zerto. Hi, Gene.
Hey, AJ, how you doing?
And we have Mike Fulton, our VP of Product Strategy from Expedient. Hi, Mike.
Hi, AJ. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Mike. So, we have a lot of things to cover today. And I kind of want to start with Bob as, in the vein of cloud wars. He's seeing the clouds go to war. But I think kind of what the industry is coalescing around now is how do the clouds work together? So, Bob, what are you seeing industry-wise on where multi-cloud is heading?
Yeah, AJ, thanks you. And hello to everybody. Thanks for spending time with this conversation here today. AJ, I think one of the big things that's happening, you see this in the early days of every industry. So in the really early days of the cloud, right, it was the cloud vendors that they came up with the terms, they came up with the names, they came up with the terminology. They also sort of set the rules. And one of those was, I am not necessarily going to make it impossible for you to go work with other clouds, but I'm not necessarily going to make it easy. And generally, you see this across different industries. At a certain point, the customers take control of the conversation away from the cloud vendors. And more, the customers were telling the vendors that you try to isolate what I'm able to do, I'm not going to be real happy with you. So either grudgingly or because it's not easy, more and more of the big cloud vendors are starting to embrace the multi-cloud notion. And especially, AJ, I think this is so critical because the requirements for business here in early mid 2021 are so different from what they were just a year ago. Companies have to be able to move faster, more intelligently, more data-driven, seamlessly, no silos of operations are integrate across their organizations. So the demands are such that I think multi-cloud is the right approach, and more of the vendors are starting to say, I'm not just going to allow it, I'm going to embrace it. So it's a great thing, I think, for both sides.
And I can't imagine what would have changed all of that. But it's these sorts of, this sort of multi-cloud drive. It was interesting to me to see things like Google Anthos as like their push into being able to support multiple clouds. And I also think it's kind of interesting that the biggest gorilla in the room, AWS, does not want to say the words multi-cloud, although they're even starting to recognize that their big data centers filled with services aren't exactly the end-all be-all that they would like them to be. And I think, is that being driven by customer demand? Is that being driven by just technology and finding the limits of the technology? Where do you think that's coming from?
Well, a couple of things, AJ, too. I think you hit on it some, that the technology is advancing at a very rapid rate, right? These things, just because a customer says, I want this, doesn't always mean it's easy. So you get the big cloud providers, certainly some of the things Expedient is doing, trying to find ways around that. But, if you think about it from, what these businesses are trying to do, the changes that they've made in the last 12 months are probably more profound than what they went through in the last 5 or 10 years before that. And I think we'll see a continued acceleration on the business end of this, of what's going to go as they move forward. So they need to have, the best of breed for, every part of their operations, but they also don't want to sort of go back to the days, the old days of IT when you could do that, but then you had to bring in an army of integrators and specialists and support people and translators to try to make all this stuff work together that was never really supposed to. So I think some of the top cloud providers, AJ, are stepping out and saying, I'm going to embrace this because it's what customers are looking for right now. I just wanted to say one other quick thing. You mentioned Google Cloud and Anthos. They've now started to develop sort of customized versions of Anthos by industry. So Anthos for retail, Anthos for manufacturing, Anthos for public sector. So as more of these great cloud vendors start to introduce more of these capabilities that embrace and allow this possibility of customers being able to use whatever clouds they want, I think it's going to be fantastic for customers, and it's going to bring big rewards for the vendors who embrace this multi-cloud notion.
Yeah, and I think AJ, if I kind of add on to what Bob was saying, I think what we're seeing is that cloud providers are starting to realize that cloud, from a customer perspective, really is an approach, not a destination, right? And we're seeing that organizations are running multiple clouds, whether they be private clouds inside their data centers or public clouds. The latest State of the Cloud report for 2021 actually suggests that companies on average are running 3.7 public clouds and another 4.9 private clouds. So whether you believe it or not, your company is already multiple clouds, right? Now the question is, are you running multiple clouds, or are you truly acting and behaving in a multi-cloud approach? And I think that's the challenge that companies are wrestling with and grappling with today.
Hey, Mike, what you just brought up, it's a little bit like, some businesses say, oh, I'm international, right? And truly they are. They have operations in different parts of the world, different countries, but each one of those is somewhat separate, and it's not easy to get each of those countries to work together. And I think the bigger goals are, how do you become a global organization, right? And I think it's really important what you just said, Mike, that you can have multiple clouds, but that does not necessarily equate to multi-cloud.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, Bob. I had not heard that one before, having spent a lot of time at Procter & Gamble, a company that truly acted and behaved like a global company. You definitely see a difference, right? And I think that's what we're seeing in the cloud now, is that companies are trying to truly become multi-cloud and behave as if they can manage their workloads and their applications the exact same, regardless of where that workload happens to be living.
And Gene, you're coming from the manufacturer space with Zerto. Kind of what's Zerto's kind of position on multi-cloud? Because data protection becomes very, very important. And now that your data is not just in the one set of four walls that you have, and it's now in multiple sets of walls, how does data protection start to become a bigger challenge there?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of piggyback on what you guys were talking about earlier with multi-cloud and the hyperscalers kind of like loosening their grasp on customers, giving them a lot more flexibility nowadays. So from a Zerto perspective and data protection perspective, we kind of take that approach already, is being agnostic as much as possible to help meet the customer demands, whether they want to store their data in one cloud, another cloud, multiple, on premises, whatever you have, giving them the most flexibility and simplicity to take their data where they need to go, protect it to where they need to protect it at, and also recover it where they need to recover it to. And some of the things we encounter a lot when we're talking about customers, talking with customers about their cloud strategy is, often they would talk about one cloud in particular, and it happens to be within the same region as where they are. So when we're talking about protecting data, we start bringing out more of the conversation into, or turning the conversation more into, all right, so if we're talking about a DR strategy or a migration strategy or multi-cloud strategy for that matter, where is this data going to live? How do you protect it in case there is a regional event that happens? You need to continue running your business. So we start opening up those conversations and getting them to look more broadly at the cloud in general for their solution. So some of the challenges today that we help them address is one, if you're thinking a legacy data protection strategy, which, typically if you're running on premises, it's backups, right? It's backups, it's storage, replication, things like that, HA. When you're talking cloud, multi-cloud, everyone does things a little differently. Not everything is apples to apples. So taking that agnostic approach helps them break down those so-called barriers of protecting their data and taking the most advantage of what's out there to offer, not limiting them.
Gene, could I ask, from what you were just saying there, you're an expert in this field of, security, data protection. And now as you hear customers enter into this conversation, right, shifting their mindset from legacy toward what happens with cloud and the different needs there, how would you assess the ways that customers are sort of placing security on a priority list? Is it up as high as you think it should be?
It comes up, but it's usually, and it's always part of the conversation, but it's still kind of disparate, right? I've got one team talking about their strategies to do, maybe it's DR to the cloud or migrate to this cloud, and it's pretty often we've had that conversation. It's a great conversation. We'll get pulled back in because now the security team wants to talk and ask questions about security. So yeah, and I know we're going to get to it down further in our webinar here, but just to touch on it a little bit, we can't continue to think the way we think on premises with silos and everyone is, everything's an afterthought almost. When we're thinking about application strategy, design strategy, cloud strategy, I think we need to start thinking as one, as opposed to different pieces of the teams, because then it just makes it more effective and we move faster.
And Gene, thanks for the fantastic segue, actually. Is that because the cloud initiatives are being driven by different groups? Or is that because there's, it's kind of fragmented? This group wants to go do some cloud stuff. This group wants to go do some cloud stuff. They're not doing it together. They're not doing it under the same initiatives. They're doing them separately, which then leads to things being broken in the overall processes. And that's kind of, I think, what you're getting at there.
Yeah, it does. When you bring that thought process to the cloud strategy, it will break processes down. Things may get left out or forgotten until you've already spent so much time planning and building something that you now have to go back, re-dig up the foundation and plug something into it. So it could delay innovation, business transfer or digital transformation, things like that. Or, after this happens, it could just pull you right back out of the cloud and start the process all over again, which gets very expensive and time consuming for a lot of people. And may also scare them away from it.
Bob, do you see that same sort of thing happening when customers are looking at doing, to me, it seems like it's not being driven by infrastructure people. I think because it's a very daunting task to look at it from an infrastructure side. But the developer side of the house is definitely pushing some of that. Kind of what are you seeing out there in the industry?
Well, AJ, let's dig into that a little. I want to come back to you on it. Do you see, is there still this rift within organizations, right? Is it still like we got the infrastructure folks over here and their point of view, or are companies starting to say, okay, we've each got our specialty, but we should have a unified outlook on things like this?
I think it depends. And Mike and you and I have had these conversations with the customers before. It depends on the organization and where they are in this journey. I think a lot of times it starts with one group. It doesn't start as a concerted effort. It starts with one group. Then everybody goes, well, wait a minute, how are we doing backups? How are we doing DR? How are we protecting this? How are we making sure that everything's secure and compliant and so on and so forth? Then it becomes a concerted effort. But it takes a little bit of time. I know that I've been part of these where from a developer standpoint, they were pulling us kicking and screaming. Yeah. And then I said, okay, well, if we're going to do this, let's go do this. Let's actually let's plant both feet and let's actually focus on what it is that we want to do instead of trying to figure out this along the way, because you don't want to haphazardly find out what your cloud strategy is. Yeah. You want to establish that up front. And Mike, we've seen this from a number of customers where, they kind of get pulled that way. right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate, AJ. You see the developers leading the charge sometimes, other times you see the infrastructure team leading the charge. I think that's why you hear some of these terms get bandied about, like DevOps, DevSecOps. The whole idea there is that we're really trying to figure out ways to get people to work together better. And in some cases, get responsibility for all of the pieces within a single group. And that's why I think if you're proactively thinking through your security needs, if you're proactively thinking through your compliance needs, you're able to leverage techniques like infrastructure as code to allow you to put as much control in the hands of your developers as possible, which will give them the ability to move faster, to drive business results more quickly, and still maintain the security and control over your environments that you need. But you've got to have all those people coming together from all of the different perspectives to make sure that the blueprints are built right up front when you try to drive that automation in.
Mike, I think, you've nailed it there. All your points are right on the mark, but especially the one about speed, right? Because if, you roll that up, every business in every industry, every part of the world now is trying to figure out, how do I move faster? Because, right, think about what all of us, for as miserable in a lot of ways the last 12 months have been. Think about, some of the things that work differently now, right? We're in charge. Somebody wants to see a first run film, you can watch it on your big screen on the wall in your home. You can watch it, on your device if you want to do that. Never before possible. And then the studios are going to have to figure out, how do I get the theaters into that mix as well? So more choice for consumers. And they've had to do that in an incredibly short period of time. The changes retailers have had to make with omni-channel, curbside pickup, every sort of business going in that direction. So if in an organization, you've got, a lot of the folks saying, hey, we need to do this and this, are we all in? And in some ways, you've got pockets of the IT organization saying, well, we're having a little trouble figuring out what's the consensus on this or that. That's going to be very damaging. So there's a new generation, I think, almost of, whether it's a CIO, the VP of IT, who are coming in and trying to push down some of those silos, right? We can all have our own specialties, but we've got to work together across there for these larger common goods. And I think that's really going to help speed up, I think, the perception of IT as not just a sort of thing separate from the business. It's going to become such a powerful enabler, an accelerator, and enhancer of the business for the companies that can do this right.
Yeah, I've said this many times. My former CEO, back when I worked at Nationwide, was known to say that Nationwide is no longer an insurance company. We're now a technology company that just happens to sell insurance, right? You hear those kinds of things in company after company, industry after industry, as digital transformation accelerates. And again, back to that point of, how is digital transformation accelerating here in the context of the pandemic, as I'm sure we're all aware of, right? That's where I go back to that quote from Satya Nadella at one of his earnings reports, where he talked about the fact that we've seen more digital transformation. We've seen 2 years worth of digital transformation in the last 2 months, right? And this was kind of mid 2020, kind of in the throes of the pandemic. Yeah. So organizations have had to step up to the plate, and particularly technology organizations have had to really step up to the plate. And one of the things that I found to be really interesting is that the promise of the cloud is foundational to being able to react and respond to the pandemic, and to be able to drive the digital transformation that we're trying to put into organizations. All those things around speed and agility, that ability to spin up and react quickly, spin down when things are no longer needed, those are part of that promise of the cloud that we're all shooting for. But those have been right at the forefront over the last year. And that's why I think it's so important. And what we've seen organizations start to do over the last several years is take that cloud operating model and bring it to the data center, bring it to the co-location facility, bring it to all of the different clouds that you want to work in. And that's why we say cloud is an approach, not a destination, right?
And I like to, sorry, Gene, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it's really interesting that you guys use the word rapid and respond quickly, evolve quickly, especially with last year and everyone having to work from home. Seeing explosive growth in the desktop as a service market, voice over IP, just to get those people working remotely, students learning remotely. So cloud adoption has, I'd say, picked up tremendously in those aspects. So we may not usually think of those things as cloud services, but they are. It's not just the infrastructure as a service, it's the software as a service and platforms and everything. So huge growth there.
Yeah, I'll tell you, when I worked at Nationwide when the pandemic hit, and in the span of a week, just like most companies, we went from having about 30,000 people on site to having 30,000 people working from home. And one of the things that enabled us to do that almost seamlessly was the fact that we had already moved all of our Office capability to Office 365. We were already in the cloud for the biggest thing that the vast majority of our people used every single day. And the ability to log in and leverage Office 365 without leveraging a VPN allowed us to meter our capacity for our key systems that weren't already cloud enabled. We were able to actually spin up enough VPN access to enable people to get into there. But if we'd had to do that for 30,000 users, we would have never been able to get there fast enough. And because we were already in the cloud with 365, we were able to do that successfully. And it was a game changer for us.
And I'll say this, we, at least as Expedient, because I was at Expedient when this started, we saw a massive uptick in the number of VPN requests. In fact, we turned up more and more VPN connections inside of our own data center than we had probably done in the previous 2 years in like the span of a week and a half. It was wild. And I think the other part of this is not just the fact that you can have people work from home, some of the business processes that go along with it. I like to pick on IKEA for this. Because Mike's heard this story before, but I pick on IKEA. I moved at the start of the pandemic. Pro tip, don't do that. But when you move, sometimes you need to get a new piece of furniture because the old one we just decided we decided to buy a new one because moving felt like a really pain in the butt, and it was. But we decided to buy a new TV stand. And IKEA decided for those first 2 months, we're just not going to be open. And that seemed like, okay, maybe by mid-May, early June, we'll probably be okay. And we want to protect our workers. When it was very clear that that was not going to be the case, IKEA decided to reopen. But the problem was IKEA runs everything in their very traditional warehouse model. We have a warehouse. All of the stuff is inside of it. If you order something, you get it from a distribution channel. The problem was that all of the online orders from March and April went directly to their distribution channel. And so their warehouses are filled with merchandise, filled with furniture, filled with all the things that they could use to fulfill orders. And they couldn't get to them because their business processes and their systems did not do that. And so it led to 6 to 8 week lead times on things that were probably 25 minutes from my house. So it was this very, very big challenge. And I heard earlier this week from a customer who said they did like 5,000 to 6,000 curbside pickup orders a week pre-pandemic, and now they do 50 to 60,000. It's like a 10x bump in doing that. Target redid most of their parking lots to do this. So there's also, I think the other part of this is when we start talking about digital transformation, there's sometimes a physical aspect to it too, or a business process that happens there as well. And I think it's really interesting to kind of think all the way through. So as you're having these conversations internally around how do we take on cloud, how do we go faster, how do we move faster, ask about the physical processes as well and where this all fits into the overall vision, right? IKEA finally got it together in September. So they had about 6 months worth of revenue that was completely compromised because their business processes didn't keep up with the rest of the world. Now, hard to see a global pandemic happening, but these are the sorts of things where they just were not able to pivot, and it was a 6-month revenue hit in the process.
Yeah.
So
AJ, I heard somebody yesterday describe sort of what's happened with telemedicine. They said, you know, we've heard this term telemedicine for years and years and years, and was never fully realized, always for a lot of, you know, in hindsight, sort of absurd reasons. Well, you can't cross state lines. You can't do this or that, right? It was almost like nobody really wanted to do it. Well, clearly everybody's into that now. And I heard somebody yesterday put it this way, and I think it reflects what you're getting out of how companies have to completely reimagine what they do, how they do it, where they do it, and why they do it, rather than just say, well, I'll use the cloud to make what I've always done a little bit more efficient. This person said another way to think about telemedicine is pandemic hits, people could no longer go to the hospital. So it was our job as healthcare providers to take the hospital to the patient. And, you know, so that's not what is possible. And it's turned out to be quite good. So I would just encourage, you know, people watching, whatever industry you're in, it's going to be hard to start that reimagination process, but you can look around. There's some phenomenal examples, and avoid that thing, AJ, that you mentioned of 6 months of lost revenue. You know, how are you ever going to make up for that? Plus the reputational hit with all these fickle consumers, like, hey, I got a certain impression of company X. I'm just not going to go back there. I'm going to go over here. So the reimagination thing, I think, cannot be overstated, the importance of that, and the crumbling of the physical and digital barriers that you described, AJ. It's got to be one of the most exciting times, depending on how the leadership wants to look at it.
And to your point, Bob, I think that's what you've just outlined, what digital transformation is all about. I teach digital transformation at Ohio State, and every single class that I teach there, I start with the idea that digital transformation is about leveraging technology and data to transform our customer experience and our business models. And when we think about reimagining the customer experience, that's what digital transformation is all about. And it's really, really exciting to be in this industry here in cloud, knowing that cloud is foundational to all of that because of the capabilities that it brings to bear. It's just a very exciting time, as you mentioned, to be in our industry.
Are you a tough grader? Sorry, AJ.
I just wanted to actually throw out there kind of an adjoining question. Someone actually has asked in the Q&A, do you believe the current work from home situation is temporary, or have we witnessed a fundamental change in business? I have definitely heard from customers who are looking at platforms and things that we're working on and said, hey, we're utilizing not having an office anymore as part of the TCO. And that's a big jump, because a lot of people weren't ready to make that sort of jump in the past. And now they're saying, like, you know, do we really need this office? One of the things I've actually appreciated about the pandemic is how many things that we took as like, this is set in stone. These are traditions. We have to do these things. And all of a sudden people are like, actually, no, we don't really need to do that. My son, what was my son saying the other day? My son was saying to me the other day, it was like, do we really have to do this? I was like, no, man, it's a pandemic. Everybody, all this is made up, man. I'm drinking a pumpkin spice tea in the middle of March, man. Come on. But there's no real seasons. Do what you want. And I think that's what a lot of businesses have actually figured out, is they can go do these sorts of things, because all of this was like, we have to have a business space. We have to have these things. And you don't actually have to. I just find that incredibly interesting, and to Bob, your point, it's very exciting to be in this whole kind of space right now, because everything is kind of up for grabs.
Yeah, I definitely think it's affected us for in some cases permanently. I've got one customer out here in Washington that I've been, they're headquartered here. I've been working with them since 2015, 2016 timeframe. And during that time, I was hearing like, they're building a new campus. They're thinking about like moving their workforce north a little bit, and work from home is going to be an option. But then they were supposed to open and move into this new campus by June of last year. They ended up not doing that, selling the property, and everyone works from home now. So, and they're like, yeah, we're, that's a huge savings, and that was Facebook that ended up buying the property, but.
Yeah, Gene,
Yeah.
I have a pretty pretty good guess on that customer, but I'm not going to put you on blast on that. I remember this story of like a big, like Washington sort of, Northwest Washington based company that built a brand new campus. And it's like brand new within the last like 18 months. And then they went, actually, we're going to sell it. I'm like, what? What? You just did this. It's like buying a car and then going, you know what? I don't like the brakes.
Yeah.
Like,
AJ, what you guys are saying there, I thought a great example of this, the CEO of ServiceNow, Bill McDermott, he said about 6 or 8 months ago, he said offices are always going to be around. He said, we just have to look at them instead of a destination. He said, we need to use offices as a productivity tool.
Mm-hmm.
And it really, again, one of those reimagining this whole notion of what's going on. I think it's fascinating too. You look at Salesforce, right? Part of Salesforce's corporate branding thing was these big towers in major cities with their logos, up above everything else. Well, they're getting out of those things. They're one of the first companies to say to our employees, it's permanent. You can choose work at home, work in the office, some hybrid variation of that. So what's going to go into those buildings?
Yeah, I think that what we're going to see, right, is that over time, we're going to see this pendulum swing, right? Everybody is going to be swinging that pendulum towards let's all work remote and we don't need offices, yada, yada. It won't be long before having an office where people can go into will actually be a perk of the job, right? So I think we've got to find this middle ground. And I love, like you mentioned, Bob, the way that Bill talks about it. Use the office as a productivity tool. There are times when being into an office is going to make you more productive and it's going to make you better at your job. There are going to be times when working from home is a better option, right? Leverage the best of both worlds, especially now that we know that we can.
So I'm just going to ask a fairly broad question here. If you're just getting started in cloud in 2021, what's the biggest hurdle to getting started? I'll ask Gene first.
Understanding what it's all about and what it entails. Do your research. Know what that means. It means to adopt it accordingly with your overall business and operational strategy. Since everything is based on consumption, cost is also going to be important. And you need to also understand what fits where. There isn't going to be one single cloud that fits all your needs. You may have some, mainframe systems that you would like to get to the cloud, but our hyperscalers may not offer services for that. So you start having to look into multi-cloud at that point and see what fits where, how it all works together. But definitely take a real good look at it, align it to what the business is trying to achieve, do your research, understand what services fit where, and then get the teams all started talking together to talk about their dependencies and how they all fit together to make it all work. I would refrain from just jumping into the deep end, not fully understanding it. And also don't make the assumption that once your data is in the cloud, it's protected. There are redundancies built in, but to meet your compliance or long-term retention requirements, they're not there by default. So you need to think about that. And then also if something happens in that cloud and you need to recover elsewhere, how do you approach that problem and how do you solve for that problem?
Hey, Gene, that's a terrific point. Take the rational approach to it. And Gene, I think it's especially important these days because you've got boards of directors and CEOs, everybody's, seeing what's going on around, just, pushing down in the organization, get us into the cloud as fast as possible. So all of your great counsel there, I think, is even ratcheted up a little. It's even more important because there's going to be pressure coming down on people and they're going to feel like, hey, I got to make some decision, even if it's not the right one. And I think your advice is really good. Like, take that little bit of extra time, make sure you're considering all the different factors here and ensure that where the business is headed then is where the cloud strategy maps to that, not going off in some different directions.
Yeah, when we talk about it at Expedient, we talk about assess, align, and act, right? And what you just described, Bob and Gene, is the align piece, right? You need to assess what you have in your landscape, know what you're actually looking to move. But then you need to be really crystal clear on where are your business strategies, where are your business outcomes you're trying to deliver out of your move to the cloud, and align your application moves based on those business outcomes that you're looking for. Because again, if it's not one size fits all with the cloud, sometimes that application may be all about performance. You may be trying to get the absolute fastest performance that you can get out of that application. It may be an application that is the front line of your customer experience, and it needs to be 100% reliable. It's always there whenever the customer wants. Or it may be an application that just kind of runs your business day to day, and you need that thing to be as efficient as possible. You want it to cost as little as possible, and cost might be the big value you're trying to get out of it. So really understanding on an application by application, workload by workload basis, what are your business objectives and how do these applications align with those business objectives, and using that to help drive which cloud, which service you're going to drop those workloads into. Because the cloud is a complex place, right? If we just look at the three big hyperscalers, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, you're talking about over 900 services to pick and choose from, right? So how do you think through all of the things that are available to you and make sure you're leveraging the best thing possible for that application?
Yeah. And kind of related to that, if you're starting now, have the challenges changed since the start of the pandemic? Has anything gotten better? Has anything gotten worse? Kind of what's working and what isn't as part of that journey?
I think Bob was going to say something.
Yeah, Bob was going to say something. Go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say, I forgot what, no, AJ, I want to tie this back a little to what Mike was just saying. I think the companies that get those 3 A's right, that Mike mentioned, assess, align, and act, then they're in the position to get the 4th A, which is accelerate. And that, I think, AJ, is one of the things that has changed most, right? You mentioned your conversation with your son, like, yeah, we can have pumpkin stuff in March. It's okay. Things are very different now. And I don't think there's going to be like this snapback in any business to like how things were before. This is it's not the new normal. It's certainly the new reality. So this pace of change, customer centricity, so that we're building everything we do to try to be able to move as fast as the customers move at the speed of the customer. As we all know from our personal lives that our desires, our needs, our interests are changing, where we buy, who we buy from, what we buy, when, where, how, all those things are shifting. And that's going to ripple all the way up from the B2C companies to B2B companies. Every company is going to have to get like this. And the on-premises world, for all the great technology that some of that stuff was able to do, and it did exactly what it was asked to do for many, many years, and it did it really well, but the world's different now. And some of those tools from the past just were never intended to be able to move at this incredible speed, flexibility, constant change, and that ability to drive, I think, as Mike had talked about, more of these, that constant goal of creating better and better customer experiences. So AJ, I think that, what is it on Mike's image there, the cloud different, right? There's got to be a new way of thinking about this. It's fine if your cloud deployments and projects are able to help you save a little bit of money and, save a little bit of time. More so what they have to be able to do is help you be the company you need to be in the future: nimble, fast, agile, customer centric, and just totally able to marshal your resources toward where the world's headed, not just to try to perfect where you have been.
Bob, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, if I can add one more to the assess, understand what your cloud proficiency in-house is, especially if you need and want to move at speed. If you're looking to get out of the data center business and you want to move your workloads to the cloud, there are options out there as well for those who are heavy in one technology that already have the in-house skill for that, to do that shift over, and then connect with some of the native services within those clouds alongside. So there is also that aspect and that option for those looking at the cloud. You don't have to hire a whole new workforce overnight.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gene. I think the cloud skills gap is real. I've seen research that suggests that 85% of organizations believe and report that they have a significant cloud skills gap. And so trying to figure out ways to help tackle that is really important. And to your point, Gene, I think one of the things that many companies forget in this rush to hyperscale is that there are other alternative clouds. There are enterprise clouds that bring that cloud operating model and a lot of the business benefits to you, but the enterprise cloud may look a lot more like your existing environment and allow you to leverage and utilize your existing skill set and resources through that transition and enable you to navigate into that cloud operating model a little bit more seamlessly. We've got one example of that here at Expedient. Our Expedient Enterprise Cloud is a VMware-based cloud that allows you, again, to leverage the skill sets that your teams already have, but still move into that cloud operating model and really take advantage of all of those business benefits that you're looking for. So I think that's a definitely a good option and something that we believe is at the core of Cloud Different. It's thinking about all the options available to you, not just pick one hyperscaler and throw everything there. And that's what we've seen a lot of companies over the last 5 to 7 years do, is they think moving to the cloud means pick a hyperscale and go. And a lot of companies that have tried that have seen that the results just haven't been what they expected. It's been more expensive than they anticipated. It's been slower than they anticipated. And they've had to start pulling stuff back out because they didn't think about it to the extent that they needed to up front. And that's why we come back to this idea of our message throughout Multi-Cloud Madness around Cloud Different, those 3 linchpins of Cloud Smarter, Cloud Safer, and Cloud Simplified. How do you really leverage all 3 of those aspects that we've been talking about all month to help you get to the business outcomes you're looking for with your cloud migration?
And I kind of want to wrap up this before we get into Q&A, and thank you everybody for putting in these fantastic questions that are out there. As we start to move towards this, and we kind of mentioned this earlier, is that, there's this developer and infrastructure sort of relationship that has to happen. How do you bring those two groups together to make that work? And I think that's something that we've talked about a lot over the course of the last month. We've talked about it throughout this entire session. It's kind of this whole, the application and the business is driving all these things, but the infrastructure people are still very responsible for all of the audit and compliance things that generally go along with a cloud infrastructure. So how do we actually bring these two groups together to make this work instead of the, sort of developers dragging infrastructure people kicking and screaming sort of thing?
Well, I think there's a couple of things there, and I think it's one, it's understanding what each side brings to the table, right? If I'm an infrastructure team looking at a topic like infrastructure as code, it sure would be nice to leverage all of the learnings from those developers that have been writing code for an awful long time, right? If I'm a developer team and I'm trying to do DevOps and I'm trying to manage my cloud directly in my environment, it sure would be nice to leverage all of those learnings about to run highly available infrastructure that the infrastructure team has been doing for the last 20 years, rather than repeating the same mistakes that they've already made and learned from many times over, right? So I think we really just have to get these two groups into conversation and realize that we're all in this together, trying to deliver the business outcomes that our companies need. We're not a warring set of factions that are each trying to win this battle.
Yeah. I think it's really important for teams to start communicating more and trusting each other more. Because when you're looking at like a hyperscaler, we'll take AWS, for example. I'm traditionally an infrastructure guy. grew up in physical infrastructure, evolved into virtualization. So I'm all about server workloads, virtualizing applications and stuff. But when it comes to the cloud, you can't bring that mentality, because then you're just going to start thinking about virtual machines, which may not be the most cost efficient way to do it. Your developers, on the other hand, they've looked at the cloud, they've used services that are native to the cloud, and they've built things by piecing these different services together to build a solution. So when you leverage the best of both worlds, you can fit things where they need to go. You can learn from the developer team what works most efficiently out there for said application. Because there will be the question when application teams come into the picture: do we rebuild this for the cloud? Do we make it native services for the cloud, or do we just lift and shift everything? And it's not just those teams. I don't think it's you need to look at the security team, the networking team, and then also you can't just bring that existing mentality over, because you need to understand you're no longer going to have control over what's underlying beneath it. So you are now freed up to learn new things. So I see it as a positive change in the enterprise.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Gene, I think you hit on a really, really key piece there at the end, right? Is that if you are leveraging the right clouds, if you're leveraging the right partners to help you get to the cloud, it frees you up to focus on more important things. It frees you up to transform your business, to transform your client experience, your customers' experiences. It frees you up to make that difference for your organization and for your customers in a way you can't manage if you're trying to manage the machines and the security and everything else. So getting the right people to the table to help you with that, I think, is an important part of the process as well.
Absolutely.
AJ, I just add that, over the past year, a phrase that's been heard a lot, and I think it should continue to be heard a lot, is end-to-end visibility. So whether that's in a supply chain, whether it's in, inventory planning, whether it's trying to align your supply chain and your demand chain, all those sorts of things inside the organization too. I think maybe, AG, one of the ways that companies can help bring those two cultures together to avoid what, Mike described as the thing you need to avoid, are the warring factions, is let each side help see the bigger view, instead of like, here's my department's goals and here's what's going on with us. Like, yeah, here's what's going on next door, and here's what's going on across the whole IT organization. Here's what's going on in the business. And if we do all this right, we're going to have a major impact on what goes on up above. But if we continue to try to bring and apply our old practices to a very different business environment, we're not going to succeed.
And I think that's actually a really great, kind of wrap on this session. I want to get into some of these questions because there's a lot of people who've asked a bunch of very great questions. Gene, people want to know about data protection and DR in the cloud, but a lot of questions in here about that.
All right.
Kind of, how does Zerto actually help customers when it comes to protecting workloads in multi-cloud environments and on-prem? And, how do you protect against things like hyperscale cloud failures, right? US West was offline a few weeks ago. So how do you actually help protect against those sorts of outages there?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this coming from the approach of we run production in our own data center and we're leveraging cloud for DR. So one of the unique differentiators that Zerto's got with our solution is our ability to do one-to-many replication. So if you happen to live and your data center lives in say the Western or Pacific Northwest, for example, since I live here, and I want to have DR in the cloud nearby, then I'll pick a West region as my plan A, right, for my DR. Start replicating stuff out there. I can test to make sure everything works. But simultaneously, I can take those same application workloads as a whole as part of our virtual protection groupings or application consistency groups, send that entire application out to an Eastern region data center. So that should one region in particular fail and your production data center happens to be in that one, you can still jump onto the console out in the Eastern region and bring your workloads up and continue to operate in that region until everything's back. At that point, you're no longer looking at an unplanned disruption. Once your original region's back up, you can then reverse replicate those changes back into the original location, and you plan a move back to your original data center. So we do offer that capability, so you're not stuck with just one option. You have multiple options, and you can send workloads up to 3 different locations. So pick your clouds, mix and match your regions. And then we've also got, for anything that lives in the cloud, especially if we're talking AWS, we have some exciting announcements coming up this coming month at our ZertoCon that will talk about that. Yeah, that will talk about that. Yep. Exclusive tease for that. I can't give away too much, but it's some stuff that's been asked a lot. I've gone to the reInvent shows, and one of those is the #1 question I've got. At the time we didn't have it, but we will have it very shortly here. So gives you another option if you do move to the cloud and live there.
So this is to the whole group. I have a bunch of questions here about portability and migrations. There's one here about, what approach do you recommend in order to have a unified effort on how to migrate workloads and not just do it because it's a trend? We respect that. That's the assessment part, right? That's looking at your workloads and figuring out where they really fit. But how do you make sure that your things are portable to say, hey, we moved this from our on-prem environment to GCP. That wasn't a great fit for what our applications are doing. We want to move them somewhere else. What are we seeing across the industry on how to actually go do that?
I can start from my perspective.
Go ahead, Gene.
Because we do continuous data protection. We can group the applications and their dependencies together as long as they're all virtual. And with that one-to-many, if you wanted to try 3 different clouds out, you can send it out to 3 different clouds. You can run non-disruptive tests, so you're not taking production down to see if these applications actually work. And our workflows make it simple. 4 clicks, that entire application stack's up and running within minutes. You can have your application team go and verify it. You can create back channels so your partners can even get in and validate the application works. And then when you stop it, it just automatically pulls it all back down. And then you didn't touch production at all. And then the nice thing about that is it's agnostic. So, and it doesn't cost very much because we're not actively replicating into running like in AWS running EC2 instances on EBS storage. We collect all the data in a very cost-efficient storage model. And then when you decide to bring the application up, it then creates the virtual machines and then brings them up for you to test. And then you can just tear it all back down when you're done. So it gives you those options. You can simultaneously get the data out there, try 3 clouds. I actually had a customer late last year, I had to cover for an SE who was out, but they were doing that very thing. They tried Azure, they tried AWS, they tried GC or Google Cloud VMware Engine at all simultaneously to see what the results were and which one they liked best. So very flexible, very simple, and it scales with your applications.
So Gene, that works pretty well for a VMware-based application or something that looks like the applications we've been building historically. But as we get into more cloud-native approaches, as we get into more modern architectures, microservices-based, trying to leverage more of what's possible out in the cloud, how does that change that conversation when it comes to backup and recovery?
Come to ZertoCon on April 20th and you'll find out. But yes, we are.
Don't worry, I'll be there.
We are definitely headed into the modern application world, and it just opens a lot more doors for options and flexibility, especially between multi-cloud deployments.
Great. What else we got in the queue, AJ?
I'm looking. I apologize for the background noise because somebody has decided to run a wood chipper right over there. So I apologize for this. I think this is actually a really interesting one. Do you think there will ever be a standardization of cloud infrastructure? Like right now, as we kind of mentioned earlier, Bob kind of mentioned this, that all of the providers individually had picked, they had set the terminology, they had set the services, and you have different providers going back and forth, trying to figure out, who's doing what. Oh, AWS built this thing. Okay, now Azure has their version of it, right? do we see open standards starting to pick up on top of these clouds so that as they're building services, they start to build maybe open standards on top of those that anyone can use?
I'd say there's at least one, and that's Kubernetes containerization. That would be an open standard that all of them are going to have and support. But and everyone's going to do it differently. Everyone's development team and product teams are, they all have their own way of solving a problem. So, and naming it. All the different marketing teams are all going to name it differently. But at the end of the day, it's I think maybe a standard as to how the core of something works, like S3 storage, object storage, for example, would be something. Open standards like that. But I think products will continue to have their own differentiators.
Yeah, I mean, part of the value of operating in a multi-cloud world is that ability to take advantage of the best of each. And if you're really relying on 100% standardization, typically that drives you down to kind of the minimum solution set across all of the capabilities, right? And so standardization has its pros, but standardization also has its cons. So I think there's a lot of value in having standardization when it comes to how you manage and operate your clouds, and having kind of that single pane of glass that allows you to have visibility and transparency into what's going on in each one of your clouds, and then allowing you to take full advantage of the best capabilities possible in each cloud. But if there was one thing, I agree with Gene, if there's one kind of standard capability that I see continuing to get pushed, it's containers. It's Kubernetes across all of the clouds.
Last question here before we go. Do we find one cloud provider easier than others for deployment? And I think this, Mike, this kind of plays into what we're doing as part of our overall cloud different message.
Yeah, the one cloud provider's got to be expedient, right?
So
I mean, we're much easier to work with than any of the other cloud providers. Somebody else is going to have to answer something else. I'm legally obligated to say that.
Yeah, Mike and I are legally obligated to say expedient, but I think part of this comes back to, I think that the easier than others for deployment isn't necessarily the technology stack, but how are you actually doing your deployments, right? If it's coming out of a CI/CD pipeline and you're using Terraform and Ansible, it doesn't really matter what the cloud is, because you have a Terraform provider or an Ansible playbook on the back end that's taking care of all of the interactions between you and that cloud. I will say that I have limited experience with Azure in terms of their deployments, but those are the sorts of things where when you're doing your deployments, you have to think about what it is that you're deploying. Are you taking on a platform as a service, in which case it's not terribly hard for you to rank deployment between Azure and GCP because they have different platforms? Or are you talking about things like virtual machines? I think we do a great job with virtual machines. AWS virtual instances take no time to spin up. So how do we actually make this so that there is how do you have a platform that standardizes that? And that kind of comes back to that original standardization question. How do you standardize your deployments and stop thinking about the individual clouds and the way that they deploy things?
Yeah, well, you kind of mentioned it. Jenkins and Ansible, like those are open standards for that type of work, that as long as the clouds support it, then they can bring that same set of tools and expect it to work the same. A few changes, but.
Sorry, Gene. And I think, AJ, the other factor in that is that we're having more and more input from non-technical people in organizations about what's happening. So I think it's going to behoove the cloud providers to score higher on that ease of deployment or speed of deployment and ease of deployment and flexibility, right? There's not a lot of things in the contract. We won't do this, we can't do this, we won't do this, and so forth. So I think somebody who plays into the smarter, simpler, safer, that sounds like a pretty good combination these days.
Bob, I thank you for that. We're going to wrap this up. This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank Bob Evans from CloudWars, Gene Torres from Zerto, and Mike Fulton from Expedient for joining us. Thank you guys so much. This has been fantastic. Again, come back, join us next week. Thank you for joining us for Multi-Cloud Madness. Next week, we actually have a webinar with Ayers, a customer of ours who does mission-driven IT. It's going to be a fantastic conversation with Hussein Martin from Ayers and myself. So come back, join us again. We're back on Thursdays, 12:30 p.m. Eastern next week. So thank you. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we hope that you continue to cloud different.